The descent pod hissed as it sliced through the upper atmosphere of Moon Virex 9, shaking with a low, rhythmic hum. Eli sat alone in his section of the spherical interior, hands folded on his lap, watching the others through the translucent barrier that separated each species. Most of them looked agitated. One of the reptilian cadets from Caltech's Prime slammed a scaled fist against the restraint straps, hissing in frustration. Another, a floating blue being from Andri Delta, blinked rapidly through a transparent membrane that pulsed with light, signaling anxiety. Eli remained still. He had nothing to prepare. That was the point of this test. No tools, no equipment, no aid. The speaker above his head crackled. A calm, computerized voice stated, "You will be dropped into Quadrant 7 of Virex 9. You are allowed no gear. You must construct a viable shelter using only what you find. You have until sundown. Survival is your responsibility." As the hatch above opened and pressure equalized, Eli felt the jolt of magnetic force pushing his pod downward. A moment later, the air was filled with silence. Too much of it. When the door finally retracted, he stepped out into a dry, colorless wasteland. The horizon stretched in every direction, a vast desert of fractured gray stone and thin violet haze. The sun above was pale, its light more cold than warm. Wind scoured the land like knives, slicing through exposed skin and carrying grains of mineral dust that lodged in the nose and eyes. Eli blinked a few times, then pulled the collar of his standard-issue Academy suit tighter. The material was designed for minimal thermal regulation, but wouldn't protect him for long. He scanned the area. About a kilometer east, he saw another student stumble from her pod. A tall avian species with a thick mane of red feathers and claws designed for flight, not ground movement. She looked confused, turning in slow circles, wings flapping weakly in the wind. To the west, a bulkier cadet, likely from the methane-rich world of Grask, was already shouting at the sky, furious. His species depended on high-density atmosphere to move efficiently, and this thin, wind-blasted air barely allowed him to function. He toppled forward onto all fours, gasping, then pulled himself under the shade of a jagged rock. Eli didn't stop to help. It wasn't cruelty. It was necessity. Everyone had been briefed. This wasn't a team exercise. The rule was simple. Construct a functional shelter before sunset or fail the exam. Assistance was discouraged. Communication was optional. He turned and started walking toward a ridge that seemed to slope gently downward. The terrain underfoot was treacherous, thin layers of fractured basalt, sharp as glass in places, brittle in others. Every few steps he adjusted his pace, listening for changes in sound. One misstep could snap an ankle or plunge him into a crevice. He moved carefully, relying more on instinct than sight, and soon reached the top of the ridge. Below stretched a shallow basin where wind had carved smooth channels into the rock. Dust devils swirled in slow spirals between the boulders. He descended slowly, half sliding, half climbing, until he reached the base of the slope. The air here was calmer. A small bluff of stone rose on the far side, offering potential cover. As he moved toward it, he noticed signs of erosion in the wall, patterns that hinted at softer rock beneath. That might matter later. A faint movement caught his eye. Turning to his left, he spotted another cadet. This one a crystalline entity with translucent limbs and a humming core that pulsed green with heat. She crouched beneath an overhang, her luminous joints flickering. Her people's bodies adapted poorly to cold, and the temperature on Virex 9 was already dropping. She didn't look up as he passed. Eli continued toward the stone bluff and pressed his hand against the rock. It was cooler than he expected, but not frozen. With enough pressure, some of the outer layers crumbled under his touch, flaking into fine dust. That was useful. He crouched, scooping a handful and sniffing it. Dry, dense with minerals. Possible insulation if compacted. Maybe. He turned slowly, scanning the horizon again. In the distance, more students were spreading out. A quadruped was trying to dig with blunt claws into the surface, only to have the soil collapse inward. Another was using long vines from her own body to assemble a lean-to from broken stone. Clever, but dangerously exposed to wind shear. There were no trees, no water, no biological cover, only rock, wind, and time. Eli walked the perimeter of the bluff and found a shaded niche, narrow but deep enough to crawl into. He wedged himself inside, back against the cold wall, and pulled his knees up. He needed to think. The wind outside had picked up. The sun had already begun its slow descent, casting long, skeletal shadows across the ground. This moon wasn't designed to be hospitable. It was a test, engineered with deliberate scarcity. No organic resources, no soil life. Nothing to build with unless you adapted. Eli closed his eyes and slowed his breathing. He couldn't outmuscle the conditions. He needed to outthink them. A sharp, distant screech echoed across the basin. He opened his eyes. Overhead, something moved. A black, serpentine silhouette gliding low, hugging the cliffside. It was fast, sinuous, with glinting armor. Then it disappeared behind a crag. That wasn't a drone. That was alive. Eli stepped out from the niche and crouched low. If there were living creatures here, that changed the equation. Life meant materials, shed skin, bones, nests, remnants. He scanned the cliffs where the creature had vanished and noticed what looked like deep parallel gouges in the stone, forming a wide trench leading downward. That could be a tunnel or a den. The sun dipped lower, its hue now closer to orange. The wind gained strength. If he wasted any more time, he'd be caught in the cold with nothing, and that meant failure, maybe worse. Without hesitation, Eli began walking toward the trench. He didn't know what lived there or what he'd find, but it was the only lead that made sense. The others could chase wind-blown rocks or patch together lean-tos that would crumble at nightfall. He needed something better, something the rules hadn't accounted for, something no one else was looking for. As the wind howled louder and the last rays of sunlight shimmered over the gray horizon, Eli's silhouette slipped into the shadows of the cliff, quiet, steady, and entirely focused. He wasn't just planning to survive, he was planning to build. The trench sloped deeper than Eli expected. Each step forward pulled him further from the surface light, exchanging it for a heavier silence that blanketed everything around him. The wind had faded the deeper he went, replaced by the faint echo of shifting pebbles under his boots. He moved slowly, testing every ledge before placing his full weight. The walls around him glistened in places with veins of mineral deposits, and the air began to carry a subtle smell, dust mixed with something organic. It wasn't rot, but it was definitely from a creature that had passed this way. His fingers brushed along the curved walls, feeling deep indentations where something large had scraped or dragged itself through. He rounded a bend and stopped abruptly. Just ahead, lying half-buried beneath a pile of loose stones and gray sand, was a massive object. Its surface shimmered with a dull, pearlescent hue, partially cracked and splintered. He crouched near it and brushed away the grit with his palm, revealing more of the curved structure. It wasn't part of the rock. It was too smooth, too deliberate. And there, along one edge, was a jagged split, revealing a hollow interior and layers of fibrous cartilage. It was a shell. Eli's mind raced. Whatever creature had inhabited this must have been enormous, twice his height at least. The shell had ridges running across it in a spiral formation, like a mixture of ancient ammonite and armored beetle. He tapped it with his knuckle. The sound was solid, but not lifeless. It was dense, yet still carried a faint elasticity, especially along the edges where the structure had splintered. He looked around. No bones, no signs of blood, no predator marks. That meant the creature had likely shed the shell voluntarily. Maybe it had outgrown it. Maybe it had molted. Whatever the case, it was gone, and it had left behind something valuable. He took a moment to weigh his options. He had no metal, no tools, and no means to carve rock, until now. If this shell retained even half of its hardness, he could use its edge like a blade, or maybe as a scoop. He examined the cracked area again and slid his hands into the split. With effort, he snapped off a curved shard, roughly the length of his forearm, and tested its weight. It was lighter than he expected, but sturdy. One edge was jagged, perfect for scraping. The other was more rounded, like a natural handle. He smiled slightly. It was imperfect, but it was something. He swung it once against the trench wall, lightly. The outer layer chipped. Not much, but enough. He swung again with more force, angling the sharp side downward. This time the stone peeled. Small flakes of rock broke free and scattered at his feet. That was all the proof he needed. Eli looked around for the best material to test this further and noticed a section of the trench wall that sloped at a slight incline, leading into a shallow alcove. The stone here was layered in soft strata, lighter in color, and held a faint warmth, possibly due to geothermal veins below. If he could dig into that section, he might be able to carve a proper shelter into the cliff face itself, shielded from wind and insulated by the rock. He made his way up and began striking in a rhythm: cut, scrape, loosen, scoop. At first, progress was slow. Each stroke sent vibrations up his arm. His hands, already raw from the cold, began to sting. But the more he worked, the more he understood the resistance of the rock and the weight of the shell piece. He adjusted his angle, relying more on leverage than strength. Chips of stone began to accumulate around him. A shallow recess took shape, deep enough for him to crouch inside. As he worked, Eli paused only to glance upward. The sky had darkened considerably. The pale sun was now a molten bruise against the horizon, and faint stars began to blink to life in the thinning atmosphere. The temperature had dropped sharply. The air no longer whispered. It bit. A distant howl echoed from above. It didn't sound like a predator's call. It was a voice. Someone shouting. Another cadet, likely one who had realized that improvisation alone wasn't going to be enough. But the sound quickly faded. No one answered it. No one would. Every cadet on this moon was responsible for his own survival. Eli returned to the shell shard and continued digging. He deepened the hollow space, widening it enough to allow him to sit with his knees drawn in. The floor he leveled by pounding it flat with the blunt edge. Small, powdery stones accumulated along the perimeter, and he began packing them into the cracks along the interior to reduce drafts. The shell tool dulled slightly but still functioned. His movements were methodical. He wasn't in a rush. He was building something real, something the others hadn't even considered yet. Most of them were still thinking horizontally, piles of rocks, leaning structures, desperate stacking of whatever looked solid. Eli had gone vertical, into the earth, using its natural insulation, its structure, and now its discarded biology. After several more minutes of digging, he paused and sat in the recess. The space was tight, but it was dry, and the wind couldn't reach him here. More importantly, it was the foundation of something larger. If he could continue deepening this cavity, if he could reinforce the walls and maybe create a heat source. His eyes drifted back to the shell. The inner lining had a fibrous texture, like layers of organic insulation. He broke off a thin strip and rubbed it between his fingers. It was soft, yet tough, ideal for layering. If he stacked enough of it, maybe he could create a thermal buffer against the rock wall behind him. He set the shard aside and returned to the shell, breaking it down carefully into segments. Each one he stacked outside the entrance of the hollow, organizing by thickness. He had no idea how long the material would hold up, but it was better than sitting in the cold. One large curved fragment looked almost like a makeshift door. He propped it against the entry to his shelter, leaving a small slit at the bottom for airflow. Inside, the dim light from the sky began to fade entirely. The moon entered its night cycle. Darkness fell like a curtain, and the temperature plummeted. Even within the trench, the cold began to seep into his bones. He pulled the shell door tighter and braced his back against the rock wall. He knew he'd need to keep working once daylight returned. This was just the beginning. But he had made a discovery none of the others had. He had found a tool where no one thought tools existed. He had built shelter with the remains of a creature long gone. And more than that, he had done it without help, without speaking, without rushing. He had listened, observed, and acted. Outside, the howls resumed, longer, more desperate. Somewhere on the plain above, another structure had failed. Someone was exposed. Someone would freeze. But here, in the trench, Eli closed his eyes and breathed steadily. The rock embraced him like a womb. The shell kept the wind away. He was still cold, but he was alive. And for tonight, that was enough. Tomorrow, he would dig deeper. Tomorrow, he would carve warmth from stone. Tomorrow, he would continue building what no one else had even imagined possible. The cold was sharp enough to keep Eli from falling into deep sleep, but not enough to make him regret his decision to remain inside the partially carved-out recess. He had endured worse conditions during Earth's survival drills in the Arctic Training Dome, though there he had at least been issued thermals. Here, he had nothing beyond his uniform and the crude shelter he'd managed to carve before nightfall. His body ached from the awkward sleeping position, but the ache meant he could still feel. That was more than enough reassurance to press forward when the pale orange rays of the next day's sun crept across the trench. Eli pushed the shell fragment door aside and squinted into the light. He stretched carefully, wincing at the tightness in his neck and the stinging cold in his fingers. Then he stepped out, the shell tool still gripped tightly in one hand. He hadn't expected comfort, but he had expected progress. And now, with the structure partially started, he felt a fire of focus that no temperature could quench. Without hesitation, he began expanding the recess. The first goal was to be able to sit without crouching and to lie down fully stretched. He also needed to deepen the interior enough that he could stay out of sight if a storm hit. His mind worked like a quiet engine. No rush, no panic, just steady motion. Every chipped wall, every packed groove, every thought calculated not in minutes, but in survivability. The shell shard had dulled slightly from the previous day's use, but it still functioned well enough for scraping away layers of sediment. When necessary, he rotated to a new edge, and when the tool fractured slightly under pressure, he adjusted his grip and pressed on. After a couple of hours, he paused only to collect his breath and reassess the layout. The floor now extended deeper into the bluff, about 3 meters inward, with the ceiling barely high enough for him to sit upright. He'd smoothed out the inner walls as much as possible, mostly to prevent them from flaking apart and collapsing in the cold. Using compacted dirt from outside, he began sealing weak joints in the roofline. It was dirty, exhausting work, and by midday, his hands were bleeding again. The skin on his fingers had cracked. His knuckles were raw, but none of it mattered. Pain was manageable. Exposure was not. By the time the sun had climbed toward its peak, Eli stepped out to assess the surroundings for new materials. As he scanned the trench floor, he noticed more fragments of the exoshell lying half-buried in the dust. Some were thin and almost translucent, others solid and dense like bone. One long shard in particular caught his attention. It was shaped like a half-moon, with a smooth surface and an edge that flared outward slightly, like a natural scoop. He lifted it, brushed it clean, and tested it against the trench wall. It moved stone more easily than the original piece. It was heavier, but better for lifting rather than cutting. He now had 2 distinct tools. Returning to the shelter, he decided it was time to move from basic survival into actual construction. He wanted something insulated, something livable. The cold of the previous night had taught him how merciless Virex 9 could be, and his goal wasn't just to endure it again. His goal was to be ready for whatever test would come next. He used the heavier scoop-like shell to dig downward, angling the floor into a shallow slope. He then began carving narrow ledges into the walls on either side. These would later serve as benches or storage if he could find materials to collect. The light from outside only reached a few feet in, so he worked carefully, feeling the stone with his fingertips when sight failed him. His rhythm was precise, like a craftsman, not a desperate cadet. At one point, while gathering more dirt to pack into the wall, Eli noticed something unexpected. Near the base of the cliff, where the stone shifted color, the dust had collected in thick clumps, fibrous, grayish, and oddly warm to the touch. He reached down and lifted a handful. It wasn't just mineral dust. It was organic, shed fur perhaps, or a molted layer from the same creature that had abandoned the shell. He carried the material inside and pressed it into the rear wall, where the air was coldest. The texture reminded him of old insulation foam, light and breathable, but dense enough to trap warmth. He stuffed it between cracks, then began forming thin pads which he laid across the floor, smoothing them flat with his boot. It wasn't much, but even a single degree of warmth could mean the difference between sleeping and shivering through the night. He worked into the late afternoon. The wind had picked up outside, but within the shelter it was still and dry. Every minute the interior grew more functional. He carved a small recess into the wall opposite the entrance, envisioning a future heat source. If he found enough dry biological matter, perhaps he could construct a primitive heating node. He remembered the brief combustion survival module from academy training, chemical reaction through pressure and friction. No tools meant no lighter, but he had muscle, time, and grit. It would come later. For now, he focused on finishing the interior. He expanded the entrance and adjusted the shell door, this time anchoring it with carved notches and small stones packed around the edges. When closed, the door pressed almost flush with the outer wall, forming a windbreak. He tested it twice, pulling it open and sealing it again. Each time it held. The insulation inside remained intact. He smiled faintly. As he stepped back into the open to collect more shell fragments, he noticed movement above the trench. A figure stood at the ridge, tall, wrapped in thick outer skin, her silhouette blurred by the wind, the crystalline cadet he had passed the previous day. She was staring downward, unmoving. Her glowing joints flickered weakly, no longer steady with power. She didn't wave or speak. She simply observed for a moment, then turned and vanished from view. Eli didn't pursue her. She had seen enough. Maybe she would return, maybe not. His shelter was not for show, it was for survival. As the light began to fade, Eli completed the final interior tasks. He smoothed the ground once more and created a low ridge along the entrance floor to keep dust from blowing in. Then he placed a final pad of insulation along the back wall and leaned against it, breathing slowly. The warmth within was subtle but unmistakable. No frost crept in. No biting wind reached his skin. Outside, the second night began. The pale moonlight glinted off the jagged trench walls. From the surface, the cliffside looked unchanged, just another strip of dead rock, unworthy of attention. But within that rock, a hidden space had come to life, built by stubborn hands and the mind of a quiet cadet. Eli sat in silence, holding the curved shell tool in one hand and listening to the muffled roar of wind outside. He had carved this from nothing. Every crack sealed, every edge smoothed, every decision his alone. And though no one else had entered his shelter yet, he had a strange sense that before long, others would come. But he wasn't waiting for them. He was preparing for what came next. The wind changed pitch just after nightfall. At first it was subtle, like the sound of pressure shifting inside a sealed vessel. Then it grew louder, denser, heavier, as if the air itself had thickened and was pressing in from all directions. Eli sat up, his back to the interior wall of the shelter, his ears tuned to every distant roar and whistle. Something was building above the trench. The rhythm had shifted from erratic gusts to sustained, violent waves. It was no longer just wind. It was the beginning of a storm. He pushed the shell door open a few centimeters and peered out. The trench, once faintly visible under moonlight, was now smothered in a fine haze that shimmered with sharpness. Grains of what looked like ash and mineral dust were hurtling sideways through the air, moving fast enough to etch shallow lines into the stone. Eli closed the door again, sealing it carefully. The shelter absorbed the sound, but faint vibrations still reached through the stone, small pulses of impact as airborne debris crashed into the cliffside. He adjusted the interior wall lining, reinforcing loose padding where he had used shed insulation. The temperature inside had already dropped several degrees in less than an hour. He pressed his hands against the inner rock, testing for weakness or air leaks. The construction had held so far. Still, he gathered a pile of broken shell pieces near the entrance and used them to brace the door further. The storm wasn't just dangerous. It was an opportunity. It would test everything he had built. If the structure survived this, it could survive anything. Outside, screams began to cut through the night. They were distant, but not so distant that he couldn't identify them. Voices, not of predators, but of cadets. Some shouted for help, others roared in frustration. One, high-pitched and panicked, cried out a word in a dialect Eli didn't recognize, but the emotion in it was unmistakable. Someone had just lost whatever shelter he had tried to build. Someone else was already exposed. Eli sat motionless, listening. A part of him wanted to stand and open the door, to shout back, to offer help. But he didn't move. He couldn't. The moment he opened his door, he risked everything he had built. The interior would fill with choking dust. The insulation would be stripped from the walls. The heat he had fought to trap would bleed out in minutes. And if the storm intensified, even a moment of exposure could blind or freeze him. He remained still. Minutes passed. Then more. And then came the knock. It wasn't loud. It was 3 slow taps, hesitant, uneven. A pause, then 2 more. Eli stared at the shell door. The wind howled just beyond it, but the knock had been deliberate. No stone had hit with that rhythm. It was a hand. He waited. Another knock followed, faster this time, and weaker. He rose, moved slowly to the door, and braced his shoulder against it as he peeled it open just a sliver. A gust of dust-choked wind slammed into him, but he held firm. Through the narrow opening, he saw a shape hunched low to the ground. Her frame glowed faintly with internal light. It was the crystalline cadet. Her body was coated in layers of frozen dust. Her joints pulsed dimly, flickering like a dying star. Without a word, Eli pulled the shell open and dragged her inside by the arm. She collapsed across the floor, her limbs trembling violently. He sealed the door immediately, then grabbed the warmest insulation patch he could find and pressed it around her midsection. She didn't speak. Her species likely used light or frequency to communicate, and right now, her body could generate neither. Her arms remained folded against her chest as she shivered in silence. Her breath came in short, raspy bursts, fogging the air in front of her. Eli didn't ask questions. He shifted closer to the inner wall and motioned her toward the insulated back corner. She crawled there with effort, her body scraping softly across the stone. Once positioned, she curled into a tight coil, hugging her knees. Eli passed her another piece of padding, and she pressed it against her side without looking at him. Another knock came 15 minutes later. This one was louder, more urgent. He approached the door cautiously and cracked it open. 2 more cadets stumbled in, a pair of desert-adapted students from Arhati B. Their bodies were covered in fine fur, now matted with ice and sand. One leaned heavily on the other. Their eyes were wide with fear. Eli opened the door wider, just long enough to let them slide inside. Then he braced the entrance shut again, dusted himself off, and returned to the others. The larger of the 2 furred cadets remained near the entrance, slumped against the shell door as if guarding it. The smaller one crawled to the center of the shelter and collapsed with a groan. Neither said a word. No one spoke for a long time. Inside the space, 4 cadets now sat in tight silence. The air was cold but breathable. The warmth from the insulated wall was weak but present. Eli shifted to the farthest corner to give the others room and focused on preserving what little heat remained. He broke more insulation into thin strips and passed them around. No one refused. Hours passed. The storm outside never relented. Occasionally, more screams echoed through the trench. At least once, something large crashed in the distance, a structure collapsing, or perhaps one of the descent pods being torn loose and flung by the wind. The others didn't react. They knew better than to hope for help now. By morning, the storm had slowed but not stopped. The wind had reduced from howls to steady groans, like the sound of a wounded beast still fighting to breathe. Inside the shelter, everyone remained quiet. The crystalline cadet had curled tighter into herself, her glow slightly stronger than the night before. The desert pair had fallen into a light sleep, backs pressed together for warmth. Eli remained awake. He sat near the door, watching it, counting every vibration that came through the rock. He knew this wasn't the last storm. Virex 9 wasn't finished testing them, but his shelter had held. His structure had endured. And now, it had become something else. Not just a hole in the rock, but a sanctuary. What he had built for himself had saved others. He hadn't invited them. He hadn't planned for them. But they had come nonetheless, pulled by instinct, desperation, or simply the unspoken knowledge that someone had done what none of them had imagined was possible. Outside, light filtered through the upper edge of the trench. The sky was gray, cracked with pale streaks of sunrise. The dust had settled. Eli stood slowly, stretched his arms, and looked at the others. None looked at him, but none ignored him either. The shelter had no hierarchy, no commands, no discussion. It had something more powerful, survival born from action, and that, on this moon, was the only language that mattered. As the second dawn cast its cold light across the scorched surface of Virex 9, the trench bore the scars of the storm. Deep gouges lined the outer cliffs. Fragments of shattered shelter attempts lay scattered along the basin floor. What had once been quiet whispers of preparation was now silence of aftermath. The storm had not only tested each cadet, it had exposed every weakness in the assumptions they brought to the exam. Inside the shelter, Eli shifted to one knee and pushed the shell door aside just enough to assess the world beyond. The wind had dropped to a low moan, and the dust had settled into soft piles along the trench walls. The sky above held no warmth, only a thin smear of pale gold between clouds of frozen gas. The storm had passed, but it had left behind its verdict. Those who endured did so not because they were stronger, faster, or more evolved, but because they adapted. Behind him, the crystalline cadet stirred, her body's glow slightly brighter now, with steady pulses of energy returning to her joints. Her head lifted slowly, and her gaze fell on Eli. She said nothing, but her nod was clear. She understood what had happened. He had saved her life without a word. Not through heroism, not through command, but through preparation. The desert pair remained curled together near the wall. One of them coughed, low and shallow, but neither moved to leave. They, too, had understood that the storm was not the true danger. The illusion of preparedness was. And that illusion had shattered for every cadet who had believed intellect alone could defeat nature. Eli pulled the shell door open wider and stepped out, boots crunching on the thin crust of crystallized frost that now blanketed the ground. The air was sharp, dry, and thin. He climbed the sloped path out of the trench, scanning the surrounding terrain. Far to the east, he saw movement. A tall insectoid cadet limped across the basin, dragging a piece of broken shelter. Another figure lay curled in a shallow crater, unmoving. Further west, a cadet with a long serpentine tail was clawing at a collapsed lean-to. No structure stood intact. No pod remained untouched. Of the dozens of students deployed, only a handful were visible, and none of them had shelter. Eli descended again and returned to the cave. The others looked up as he entered. No one spoke, but the room had changed. Where once had been quiet desperation, now rested a deeper stillness, respect, perhaps, or acceptance. The crystalline cadet raised a trembling hand and pointed to the door, a flicker of light passing between her fingers. Her voice came at last, soft and cold. "More will come." Eli nodded, and they did. By midday, 5 more cadets had arrived, one by one, bruised and limping, covered in frost and failure. A silent agreement passed through each of them as they entered. No questions, no pride, no resistance. They filed in, found space, and settled against the rock. The shelter groaned under the weight of bodies and breath, but it held. No one argued. No one demanded. Eli had not spoken since the night of the storm. He had not given orders or taken credit. He worked in silence, reshaping the doorway, reinforcing the roof with new shell pieces, redirecting airflow so that moisture from breath would not pool and freeze. He shared the remaining insulation evenly. When water was needed, he used a smooth rock to collect condensation and distribute it from hand to hand. An alien professor finally arrived late in the day. Her form shimmered like liquid metal, hovering above the ground in a containment field. Her voice broadcast through a speaker orb that floated beside her head. She scanned the trench, noting the destruction, the number of collapsed structures, the scattered pods and broken stones. Then she floated to the shelter. Her light cast a dim green glow across the doorway. She paused as the shell door opened. One cadet stepped out, then another, and then another. One by one they emerged, each blinking into the harsh light, each bearing the same look of fatigue and astonishment. Finally, Eli stepped forward. He said nothing. The professor addressed him directly. "State your method." Eli didn't answer immediately. His voice was hoarse from disuse. When he finally spoke, it was without pride. "I dug. I used what I found. I kept it warm." The professor tilted her head. "You broke the assumptions of the exam. You created space that did not rely on external structure. You repurposed biological remnants into sustainable protection. Why?" Eli shrugged slightly. "Because everything else failed." There was silence. Then the professor nodded once, slowly. "Recorded. Surviving cadets will be extracted." The orb floated upward and projected a signal. Moments later, small hovercraft began appearing on the horizon, skimming across the dust toward each living cadet. As the others prepared to leave, one by one they turned back to Eli. Some offered nods. Others simply paused at the edge of the trench. The crystalline cadet placed a hand briefly on his shoulder before being lifted into the craft. The desert cadets, wordless as always, nodded in tandem and vanished into the ship. Eli remained behind until the last of them had gone. The wind had died completely. The trench was quiet again. He stepped back into the shelter once more and looked around at the empty space. It was filled with marks, places where others had leaned, breathed, slept. He picked up the shell tool from where he had left it and tucked it under one arm. As the final retrieval vehicle descended, its lights swept over the trench, casting long shadows across the stone. Eli took one last look at the structure. He had come here alone. He had built alone. But in doing so, he had created something that others needed. As he stepped aboard the retrieval platform, the professor spoke one last time. "Instructors will study your strategy. Your evaluation will inform a revision of the curriculum. Expect questioning." Eli nodded. "Understood." The craft lifted into the sky, leaving the shelter behind, still intact, still standing. A place born of necessity, shaped by one mind, and proven by survival. In the months that followed, a new phrase spread across the academy. It began as a whisper among cadets and ended engraved in the central training dome. "Give a human nothing, and he will build a home.